you've been lied to about history. Not in some conspiracy theory way, but through stories so repeated, so embedded in textbooks and documentaries that questioning them feels almost rebellious. These aren't minor details. They're foundational myths that shape how we see entire civilizations. Let's dismantle some of the biggest ones. Start with the Great Wall of China. You've heard it's visible from space, right? Astronauts have been saying it for decades, except they haven't. They've been correcting this myth for decades. The wall is wide, yes, but it's made of materials that blend almost perfectly with the surrounding landscape. From low orbit, you can't see it without magnification. You know what you can see? Cities, highways. The greenish glow of phytoplankton blooms in the ocean. But a narrow stone structure snaking through mountains? No chance. The myth likely started in 1938 with a magazine claim, years before anyone had actually been to space to check. Then there's Napoleon. Short, angry, compensating with military conquest. The image is seared into popular culture. Only problem? He wasn't short. He was 5'6", maybe 5'7", perfectly average for a Frenchman of his era. The confusion came from the difference between French and British measurement systems. In French units, he was listed as 5'2". British propaganda seized on this. Cartoons depicted him as a tiny tyrant, and the lie stuck. We built an entire psychological complex, the Napoleon complex, around a man who was literally average height. Vikings wore horned helmets. You've seen the imagery everywhere, from Wagner operas to football team logos. Except archaeologists have never found a single horned Viking helmet. Not one. What they have found are ceremonial horned helmets from the Bronze Age, centuries before Vikings existed. The theatrical edition came from 19th century Romanticism, artists trying to make Norse warriors look more dramatic and barbaric. The Vikings were brutal raiders, sure, but they were also traders and explorers who valued practicality. Horns on a helmet, that's just giving your enemy something to grab and twist. Medieval people thought the earth was flat. This one's taught as fact. The story of Columbus bravely defying ignorant clergy. It's complete fiction. Educated Europeans had known the earth was round since ancient Greek times. Eratosthenes calculated its circumference in 240 BC with remarkable accuracy. Medieval scholars debated the size of the earth, not its shape. The flat earth myth was invented in the 1800s by writers who wanted to paint the Middle Ages as a dark, superstitious era. It worked so well, we're still teaching it. Why do these myths survive? Because they're simple. They're memorable. A short emperor makes for better storytelling than an average-height military genius. Horned helmets look cooler than plain iron caps. But here's what most people miss about historical myths. They don't just distort the past. They actively shape how we think about entire cultures and time periods. Consider what happens when you believe Vikings wore impractical headgear. You're seeing them as primitive, style over substance. When you think medieval people believed in a flat earth, you're dismissing an entire millennium of human achievement. These aren't harmless errors, they're foundational misunderstandings that color everything else you learn about these eras. The Iron Maiden is another perfect example. That torture device, the human-shaped cabinet lined with spikes, never used in the Middle Ages. Never used in the Middle Ages. It was invented in the 1700s, possibly as a hoax or misguided museum piece. By the time anyone thought to question it, the image had already spread through horror stories and penny dreadfuls. We constructed an entire understanding of medieval cruelty around a device that didn't exist. Here's where it gets interesting. Some myths survive because they serve a purpose for the people spreading them. The Columbus flat Earth story. It was pushed by 19th century writers who wanted to portray the Catholic Church as anti-science. Napoleon's height. British propaganda during wartime. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate constructions that outlived their creators. But the most persistent myths are the ones that feel right. They align with what we already believe about a time period or culture. Vikings as savage barbarians wearing dramatic helmets. That fits the narrative. Medieval Europe as backwards and superstitious. Sure, that tracks with what we've been told. The Great Wall visible from space. It's such a massive structure, of course it must be visible. Our intuition lies to us and we trust it anyway. The real question is what we're missing while we're focused on these fabrications. When you're picturing horned helmets, you're not learning about the sophisticated Norse legal system or their remarkable navigation technology. When you're laughing at flat Earth believers who never existed, you're not studying actual medieval astronomy or the universities they founded. The myths don't just add false information, they actively crowd out the truth. And some of these distortions have consequences beyond trivia nights. The idea that medieval Europe was uniquely barbaric and ignorant? That shaped centuries of colonial justification. If the West's own past was dark and primitive before the Enlightenment, then other cultures could be painted the same way. These myths became tools. What's fascinating is how resistant we are to corrections. Tell someone Napoleon was average height and they'll still picture him short. Show them evidence that Vikings never wore horns and the image persists. We've invested in these stories. They're part of how we organize historical knowledge in our heads. Admitting they're wrong means reorganizing everything connected to them. The Great Wall myth is particularly stubborn because it feels like it diminishes Chinese achievement to say it's not visible from space. But here's the thing, the actual achievement, building a 13,000-mile fortification system over centuries using pre-industrial technology, is far more impressive than being visible from orbit. We don't need to exaggerate. Reality is already remarkable. So the next time you hear a historical fact that sounds a bit too perfect, a bit too neat, ask yourself who benefits from the story. Check whether it confirms what you already thought you knew. Because the most dangerous myths aren't the obvious lies. They're the ones that sound like they should be true. The pattern repeats across every era you examine. Romans throwing Christians to lions in the Colosseum? Happened occasionally, but nowhere near the scale popular imagination suggests. Most executions were far more mundane. Nero fiddling while Rome burned? He wasn't even in the city and the fiddle hadn't been invented yet. Einstein failing mathematics as a child? He was exceptional at math, but the story persists because we love the idea of genius overcoming early failure. What's striking is how much effort goes into maintaining these myths once they're established. Publishers keep printing the same claims. Museums display the same misleading exhibits. Tour guides repeat the same scripts because that's what tourists expect to hear. Correcting the record becomes an uphill battle against inertia and expectation. You start to notice a pattern in what gets mythologized and what gets forgotten. The dramatic always wins over the mundane. The simple explanation beats the complex truth. The story that confirms existing biases spreads faster than the one that challenges them. History isn't just written by the victors. It's rewritten by whoever tells the most compelling story. And here's what that means for you. Every historical fact you think you know deserves a second look. Not paranoid skepticism, but healthy curiosity. Who first made this claim? What evidence supports it? Does it align a little too perfectly with a narrative someone wanted to push? The truth is usually messier, more complicated, and more interesting than the myth. The Vikings didn't need horned helmets to be fascinating. Napoleon didn't need to be short to be one of history's most consequential figures. Medieval scholars didn't need to believe in a flat earth to make their era worth studying. Reality doesn't need embellishment. We just keep adding it anyway, then forgetting we did. Question what you think you know. Most of it is probably wrong.